Welcome everyone for today's BBL session. Today we have Dr. Rachael Bradley Montgomery. She is an adjunct lecturer here at the University of Maryland. She also has a charity. She runs a charity. It's called Accessible Community, and she's a huge accessibility advocate. Yeah, and so today she's going to talk about design patterns to support individuals with cognitive and learning disabilities. So she will be taking questions on the go, and we'll also have a 10-minute Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, I would let her take.
Thank you so much. Hello, how are you all today? Good. Excellent. So I prefer to converse more than just stand up here and speak, so I am going to be trying to draw you all out a little bit too amongst the pizza and the time. I want to just start by having you think about this for a minute. Think about the last month or two. What was the worst thing that happened to you while you were online? Like the most frustrating thing that had you cursing your computer and wanting to throw it out the window. Just think about it. I'm going to come back to this at the end, but I just want you to take a minute and ponder what bad design did to you at some point in the last little bit. Can you leave this open? All right. So a little bit more about my background so you know where I'm coming from. So I have my master's in information library science from the University of Illinois. I have my PhD from here. Love this place. My passions, as he mentioned, are accessibility and usability. I am all about helping people share their talents in the world and trying to make computer systems and buildings and everything else help with that and not hinder it. That's what gets me up in the morning. I've worked in corporate and government space for about 15 years. In May, I stepped away from that to found the charity he mentioned. It is called Accessible Community. The whole focus is to help small businesses, community organizations, places that cannot afford traditional, expensive accessibility help, actually engage and support people with disabilities. So it's working at a very different level than I've spent most of my career at. The charity is building 3 tools, which you may or may not be interested in, but one, just to let you know, is Tally. It walks people who know nothing about accessibility through evaluating a building, evaluating a website, evaluating an event, and their policies and accommodations, step by step, yes, no questions, so that if you know nothing, you can actually get it through. We finished beta testing that, I think about a month ago. We're putting it up online on the cloud. It should be up next week. Socially is going to be something that addresses what I keep hearing from business owners when I talk to them, or church owners, which is how do we actually reach people with disabilities? So it's going to basically be Yelp for people who need special accommodations in their interactions during the day. And then we're working on a Braille translation tool. Have you ever looked at a sign and saw Braille and wondered what it actually said? So one of my very close friends is blind, and one of his big baseball fans. If you ever are at the baseball stadium, all of the men's room are labeled women in Braille. So there are no men's room in the stadium for people who are blind. So that kind of led to that tool and what we're working on with that. All right. The other 2 things we do, we provide a newsletter for business owners, organization leaders. We do an internship program to teach people accessibility. And so we're running that. All right. In addition to that, I am on the World Wide Web Consortium with the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, and since that's what we're going to talk about today, I want to give you some context about that and just talk about what it is, what it isn't, and give you some perspective. So the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, is an international community that works to create open standards to ensure that the web works, basically. Within that, there is an initiative called the Web Accessibility Initiative. And their goal is to create standards and support materials, information to help developers, content creators really understand and implement accessibility, so actually do it. Within that group, going down yet another level, is the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, the AGWG, and they develop guidelines to make web content accessible. So that is the WCAG standard, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines standard. Has anybody heard of that? About half the room, okay. So that is a series of very, I'm going to say strict guidelines that are testable and repeatable and are usable to create good, solid web content that can reach people with disabilities. It was 1.0 was kind of the late 90s, 2.0 was around 2010, 2.1 just came out last year, we're working on 2.2 right now, and that should be out next year. So it's an evolving platform. Have you all heard Section 508? Does that sound a little more familiar? That points to the web content, web accessibility guidelines, as its kind of technical spec. There is also another working group called the Accessible Platform Architectures, the APA, and they work across all the other W3C groups. So in W3C is the group that specs out HTML, the ones who write the standards for CSS and how that ties in. And so the platform architecture group works across all those groups to ensure that the specs that are written are accessible. So it ties accessibility into the actual spec themselves. Under both those working groups is a task force. So now we're all the way down at the bottom level of this. The task force is called the Cognitive and Learning Disabilities Accessibility Task Force. So it's about how do we create accessible websites for people with cognitive and learning disabilities. And I'm a co-facilitator for that very recently. And I need to kind of say two things at this point. And the first one is that I'm up here talking, I am the co-facilitator, but I'm giving you my views and opinions and point of view. I'm not speaking either as a W3C rep or as even the co-facilitator providing any kind of consensus view on this. So these are my opinions and thoughts on it. The other thing is I am actually not a specialist in cognitive disabilities. I would not get up here and say that. I am a specialist in accessibility, I'm a specialist in usability. This is a portion of kind of what I know, but it is not where I deep dive. Now, I am rapidly becoming one, but I'm not there yet. So that's probably not where I'm going to take this presentation, but if you want to talk about that, we can. So when we talk about cognitive and learning disabilities, a term we tend to use more often is neurodiversity. And so neurodiversity covers a whole range of things. So it covers individuals who are on the autism spectrum. It includes people who have Down syndrome. It includes people with aphasia, and that is where language doesn't necessarily translate correctly when you're talking. People who have dyscalculia, which is around numbers and understanding numerical information. Dyslexia, and that's going to be letters and reading and words. But also people who experience depression, because that affects how you process information. People who are aging, that also affects your memory, it affects your retention. Individuals who are experiencing anxiety, who have had traumatic brain injuries or have experienced stroke. And this is just kind of the high level. There's a number of other experiences that people have. And the reality is, when we go out, if you don't have a cognitive disability that is recognized and articulated, when we go out and we are very tired, when we go out and we are distracted because we are talking to somebody on our phone at the same time we're trying to do something, when we are nervous or anxious or sad or depressed, all of that affects our cognitive functions. So while what this task force is doing is very focused on supporting these individuals, it really creates support for everybody. All right, so I want to talk a little bit more about that, and please feel free to ask me questions when I don't know. I'm going to be really upfront and tell you I don't know. I'll give you my best shot, but then I'll tell you when I'm not clear. So first of all, it's really focusing on people with impaired short-term memory. So this is one area you need to think about when you're designing. These individuals are going to have trouble remembering passcodes. If you're requiring 14-character passcodes, there are some individuals who aren't going to be able to remember it. So something that is being discussed a lot at the WCAG group is how do we create accessible authentication in a way that has enough redundancy, have enough redundancy to make sure that people can successfully get into their accounts and have it be safe and secure, because you don't want people using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as their passcode because they can't remember anything else. Also, they're going to have trouble learning new symbols, new interface paradigms. So we think about all the different interfaces you interact with. You can just think about the search paradigm. There are paradigms, an email paradigm, a search paradigm. If you create something and it dramatically changes how something works, these individuals are going to have some trouble with that. The next group are people with language-related disabilities, and they're going to need very simple language and simple instructions. And just kind of to point this out, not everyone who has a cognitive or learning disability falls in all of these categories. And so there's this tendency, especially when we start talking about the language, and we're going to dive into that a little deeper, to think, oh, everybody needs really simple, short words, and then we're good. And that's not true. Some people do, and some people need that kind of shorter summary, but not everyone. In addition, some people really relate well to graphics. They don't necessarily relate well to words or text, and so they're going to be interacting with graphics or symbols, and they need familiar ones, ones that make sense, that map to what is common across the society and the culture. The next group are people with communication disabilities. So these people need literal language. Metaphor is going to be confusing. Complex language is going to be more difficult. And they may really want to have very literal, solid text and symbols. And then this calcula kind of gets pulled out in its own place in that individuals there may not understand numerical references. So they need text alternatives to that. So a very standard accessibility criteria is alt text for images. You provide an image for individuals who are blind, you provide some kind of text description. For this group, you need to think about numbers and numerical concepts, mathematical concepts the same way. You need to provide some kind of textual alternative to that. All right. Then we have people who struggle retaining focus. So if you think about you're doing your project, your homework, you look away, you come back, you're probably able to figure out where you were pretty quickly. But for some people, that's hard. These are individuals who struggle with distractions. There's a lot of media on a website. If there are other things going on that are not the main content, they're going to have trouble focusing. And they need some kind of structure to help them reorient to where they were when they got distracted. So those are kind of the subgroups, and they relate, I hope you see that relationship back to some of the disabilities I first mentioned. But then there's kind of just a broad category. A lot of people really need help minimizing errors and completing their tasks, so getting from the beginning of a task to the end of the task. And a number struggle with complex multi-stage processes. So I want you to think about a situation where you were maybe ordering a plane ticket, and you get at the beginning, and you go step by step through that very complex process. You have to make a lot of decisions from beginning to end. For someone with some cognitive disabilities, there's a lot of fatigue that goes with that. Now they walk away, they have to take a break, they step away, they come back, it's timed out. They have to start over. They weren't necessarily notified about that time limit. So now it's a surprise. Now they can't really be successful because they can't get from the beginning of that process to the end of the process successfully. So how do we help people with that? How do we support that? And then finally, just even finding content and features that they need can be difficult. All right. So first question, kind of for your thought and feedback. So if we know these are challenges, and we do, we have lots of research that supports it, why don't we just get accessibility guidelines written for them? And this kind of goes to the core of how accessibility guidelines write. I'm just curious if anyone has thoughts. Do you notice anything interesting about what I just said? Would it help you? Would all of what I just said probably make an impact on you as well? So one of the things about accessibility guidelines is, and it's kind of a rule of thumb, it doesn't become a guideline, an actual formal guideline, unless it disproportionately assists someone with a disability. Now, it might help a lot of other categories, but in general, it has to be something that you can say, this is specifically accessibility and not usability. The challenge with the cognitive support space is it sits in between the two. And the more I talk, the more you're going to go, oh, that's a usability principle. Oh, that's something I recognize as something that's going to help me. And so that is a real challenge for the COGA task force in trying to come up with a way forward. And so after kind of trying to get how many different guidelines in that would help, and some are, one of the things the task force decided to do was take a step back and just create a design guide. And so this is available in first draft. And part of the reason I really wanted to come talk to you all today is that this is open for comment. We want feedback. So if you are in this area, if you're either interested in HCI or you're interested in accessibility, I'm going to encourage you to get on this link. You can search up Content Usable COGA. You will get here. Read it. provide comments, and I'm going to give you a little bit more ways to do that at the end of this, because it is just so important that the community comment back on this topic. It is supplementary, and it's advice. So WCAG is almost a legal document in that many laws across the world point to it and say this is a standard. This document we're creating is not. It is guidance, it is assistance, it is help, really specifically for developers and for designers and for UX people. There are two parts to this document. The design guide I'm talking about today is currently in the appendix. One of the feedback that we have already gotten is that we should move that up and kind of switch what's in the appendix and what's not. So if you get to it about 3 months from now, you'll probably see that flipped, but if you look at it when you go home today, you'll notice that. Within that appendix, there are 8 objectives. Each objective includes some user testing and some user stories. And then below that are design patterns, very practical design patterns, and each one includes how it helps, it includes details about the pattern, and it includes examples. All right, so this is the first objective, and this is where I really need you all to tell me what you're interested in, because I have a very short period of time here, and the 2 ways this talk could go, I could just read this for you all and be done in 5 minutes, which is not going to be helpful. Or we can talk about the ones that you are most interested in. So I have put a series of slides up, and I want to know which ones are interesting to you, and we can talk about them. So the user stories that go with this objective, and this objective is helping users understand what things are, so recognize what things are, and how do I use them? You know, so think about a button on a web page. A well-designed button is obviously clickable. It stands out. You know what it is. You know what you're supposed to do with it. That would be successful in this design objective. The user stories around it are, I am familiar with the user interface, where everything happens, and I know how to work it, and what will happen when I work it. That's one of the big goals of this. I know what to click to make something happen. I like content delivered in an easy-to-understand mode. So the content itself, I get. I like simple content with few options and consistent text. I know what this page does, and I know how to do each task on the page. So those are the kind of overall user stories that are tied with this objective. Any of these jump out at you as something to talk about? Some of them probably are just like obvious. Make the purpose of your page clear. That comes from a clear title, a clear heading. Yeah?
What do you mean by chunk media?
Absolutely. So the point of chunk media is this ability to actually digest things in short pieces. And so if you think about, and this is something that ties back to the specs, if you think about a media player, and I'm just going to use video as a point, where you have to start at the beginning, and you watch for an hour and you get to the end, and there are no break points in it, that would not meet this pattern. Whereas if you think about a different player where you can do in 10-minute increments and take pieces and hop back and forth between those, like a DVD is divided, that's what that is really getting at. And ideally, those media chunks are labeled. So again, you know where you are, you can orient pretty quickly. So great question. Others of these that stand out? And I should have asked, does anyone need me to read the slide? I am happy to do that if that's an accommodation that's needed. It's a little light. Yeah.
About, so user design that the user is likely to recognize and understand. How does that, like I understand that that's necessary, but also design changes like radically over time, and how do you kind of like deal with that?
That is a great question. How do you deal with design changes? So there's a couple things, and this is strict, right into usability, even stepping out of accessibility and going into usability. When you do user research, contextual inquiry, all of the understanding of how your target users are going to work, you're going to understand what design patterns make sense to them. You're probably going to look and do some competitive analysis against other applications or other designs that work. That's going to give you a good idea of where to start. Now, if you want to evolve your pattern, and I've worked with development teams in places that need to do this, you start from kind of the normal place, and then you move them a little bit at a time. And we're going to talk about Objective 8, which is around personalization, which is your user's way of going back to what they're comfortable with. But for this one, this is really around, first of all, starting with recognizing. And there's an exception to this, which says if you're going to do something radical, which you might want to, Google was really radical when it first came out. Make sure you provide some instructions and orientation. Recognize you're doing something radical and help users to do that. And so there's those kind of two options. One is a slow evolution, where you kind of move people through, give them something that they recognize to start with, and the other one is to provide really clear instructions on how to do it. Yeah.
I'm not sure which bullet point this fits into, but what comes to mind is when you build out, let's say, a website and you have it responsive to go from a regular computer screen to mobile type devices, the entire format of the site can change, how the menus are changed, the experience changes. And so designing a site like that versus designing one that's specifically mobile site version.
Yep.
I could see these being accessibility challenges and usability challenges, trying to understand the relationship between
the two.
Between the responsive and mobile version, when you're trying to make sure things are clear, things are understood, things are easily identified.
And that is a great point, because there are questions around, and you'll see on the next objective, there's one that says something should be recognizable without scrolling. Like if you have a key task, like the submit button, you should be able to see it when you need it without hunting and pecking for it. So kind of the worst case example of that is I have to hover, if anyone's used Squarespace, sorry for the under the bus here, but if you have to hunt and peck for the pieces, if you want an edit, you have to figure out where the hover is to get the edit icon to show up. That's kind of your really not great example. Whereas if you're at the bottom of a form, you're at the last required field and submit is right there, that's kind of your best example. But when you start talking mobile, you talk main navigation. Well, your main navigation is at the top of your desktop. Well, now you're collapsing it down to a menu that looks, has 3 little lines. Is that easy for someone to, that's a new paradigm, right? So some people are going to learn that faster than others, and some people are going to be comfortable with it, but you've lost any text orientation on it. And so trying to figure that out, it is a real challenge. And how you make that, that's a really great example of how do you make that a standard? You can't. So you have to make it a guideline, and how do you talk about it? You wouldn't want to collapse it to something that was completely unrecognizable to anyone. That would be kind of the other extreme. But the more you can keep it consistent between the mobile and non-mobile, the better it's really going to help people adapt and adjust. And you'll see, again, Objective 8, we'll talk a little bit about how do we kind of address those problems. Yeah.
So I see that, like, provide visual cues and text that communicate structure. So I've seen kind of tutorials on websites that have a lot on like Discord. When you first make an account, it will show you what all the buttons are and what they do.
Right.
But so that requires a lot of JavaScript.
It does.
And so, do we care about users who, for some reason, don't have JavaScript enabled? Is that something that you have to balance?
Yeah. That's been an interesting conversation point in the accessibility world, because JavaScript has gotten more accessible in the newer versions of it. There are people who definitely turn it off, and so having an alternative, like a paper or a PDF, I say paper, but like a static copy of content like that would be a good alternative to that for people. So the answer is yes, you should care to some level. It is less frequently turned off now, and this is my opinion, I haven't done numbers, but it's less frequently turned off now than it was, say, 10 years ago. But, and having the alternative is there, but at some point you also hamstring yourself. And so this is, in my opinion, an art. Like, you are trying to figure out, how do you balance it? How do you think about, what can I do with my application to help 80% of the users? How do I then support the other 20% of my users? What is that balancing act, and how to do it? That's a great question. I'm going to go to Objective 2. So the Objective 2, I think, is actually going to what you were just saying, help the user find what they need. So again, make key content visually stand out and visible to users without needing to scroll. That was the first one I said. So critical. Search. Why would we not have a search capability? So it's just such a critical one. And then letting users return, and particularly the back button in the browser. So for people with cognitive disabilities, that's such a recognizable, easy way out of how did I get here? I'll hit back. They lose all their data. That's going to be a challenge. So especially in single-page apps where back is going to lose everything because it's not being retained, warnings, making sure people are aware, finding ways to save that data for short periods of time so people can recover from that problem, really thinking about that, and that's what this objective is. So this is nice and short compared to objective 1. Questions on that one? Thoughts?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So how do you find a balance between providing the experience to people who have cognitive disabilities and people who don't? Because if there is a website and you have traffic from both the audience, having a warning message every time you go back would be kind of like an frustrating experience for
other people.
who don't have such disabilities. How do we find the balance there? Like what's the...
So in that very particular example, I usually suggest a warning message that stops people with an opt-out based on, and then you can tie it to their cookie or whatever you're tracking them on, depending on what kind of app and what environment you're building in. But there's settings and the ability to change settings. Now, I usually recommend people create the most usable portion and then let the more advanced users set settings to become more advanced. And it used to be in PowerPoint, and again, this is a number of years ago, but it used to be in PowerPoint. The first time you came into PowerPoint, you got the wizard view. You got the really simplistic view that walked you through, and at the end of it, it was like, okay, you know what you're doing, just check this box and we won't give this to you again. I love that idea. I think Schneiderman actually is, Dr. Schneiderman is one of the people who really founded that idea in the usability profession, and I think it really applies for people with cognitive disabilities. There are other ways to do that, and this is one of the tensions, and I was going to talk about it later, but I'll just jump into it now. I think it's one of the tensions around how do you support people with cognitive disabilities. There are two different ways of doing it. One is you create content that supports them. So you just say, okay, I am going to create very simple text here. I'm going to chunk things away. I'm going to use very familiar systems. I'm going to just commit to using the familiar paradigm. And I, as a content creator, am going to go that direction. That's one route. The other route is I am going to design and code things so that people can change what I give them. And that's the personalization route. And I kind of get the impression maybe Greg will, Dr. Vanderhyden will talk about it next week a little bit. Personalization is all about letting APIs or plugins or CSS sheets change how something's delivered. So for some people with low vision, they need the mobile view. And so making sure that it's responsive right off the bat is coding to support that situation. When you start talking cognitive, it's replacing text. It's stripping background images. It is replacing non-familiar symbols or the new great thing you created with something very familiar. It's moving help to the upper right-hand corner of the screen or to the bottom of the screen, depending on the user and what they're comfortable with. It's making sure it says help or has a question mark. So it's coding things in such a clean way and with markup that you can go in and adjust it. And that's kind of the other track, and that's objective 8 here, is how do we think about it that way? And for the standards that are being written for accessibility, for 2.2, right now the way they're going is either one or the other. And there is a new spec coming out called personalization. So in the accessibility realm, there is HTML, CSS, and there's something called ARIA, Accessible Rich Internet Applications, which is a spec that lets you code really specifically, mostly for people who are blind. There are other people who benefit from it, but it will really support screen readers very, very well. The personalization spec is going to be all about saying this information on my page is important. This information is my help information. This is my primary controls. This information is not so important. So now then I can go in with a plugin and say strip everything that's background, strip everything that's not important, move anything that's help to this location and give it this symbol. And now all of a sudden, no matter what the content author has done, I'm having a very consistent, familiar experience. So that's the two routes that this is really going in, and but it's not, nobody's quite sure which way it's going to go. And some of that is the plugins aren't completely built. So there's some examples, but there's not a really popular, oh, Firefox has it already built in and you can go with this example yet. So that's something really to watch over the next few years. I think it changes usability fundamentally too. Yes?
Is this what ReaderView does or attempts to do on websites that don't exactly have?
I am not familiar with ReaderView.
So it's a feature in Safari and I think Chrome and also Firefox where it will whatever website it is, attempt to strip away all the content except for the title and body text.
Okay, so
and
yes, that
some
would be
body
a very
images.
simple example of this. And that assumes that the body text and the title are both tagged correctly in HTML.
Or I think it might infer it, which is why it's not 100% successful.
And so that's why we need the tags. Like, we really need attributes in HTML that say, this is my content. And if you think about a site that has body content and ad content, something like that probably can't distinguish between the two.
Yeah, and it doesn't.
And it doesn't, okay. And so the personalization spec, which is due out in about a year, and it's coming up on first draft, I want to say it's actually in a few months, so something else to keep an eye out if you're interested. It's going to give deliberate attributes, just like you would put alt equals quote quote or alt equals quote and whatever your alt text is, you would put data dash simplification equals critical, and that data then would be something that would always show up when you stripped information. Yeah?
Is there any resistance to the idea of people putting in tags that say, here are the ads so you can remove them?
Probably. I think it actually has gone the other way of saying this information is important, and then the ads just don't get a tag. And my guess is that's why, though I'm not on the personalization task force, so I can't say one way or the other on that. But yeah, it is kind of fun to be on the WCAG group because Google's on it, you know, Amazon's on it. All of the different major players are sitting in that room, and you get perspectives as well as people from Japan and people from Europe and people from, you get this whole international perspective on how do you solve a problem that is both great for people with disabilities and great for the software developers. And how do we actually make that merge? And it's a consensus organization, which means that everybody has to agree, which can make for some very long conversations. But at the same time, there's such rich conversations, and there's so much passion in the room. It's so neat to be there. And that is something that people will bring up because the big software development companies care about the ads, right? Like, that's important, revenue is important. So how do we do that and balance it in a way that helps people and make sure it works? All right, this is the next one. Use clear and understandable content and text. I'll let you read some of these, and I'm just going to pull out a few. The importance of white spacing. It has become a very big conversation. Just around how do you make sure you design and develop to allow people to separate words or sentences or paragraphs the way they need them. How do you put spacing after a punctuation? Do you always want a couple spaces after the period? Well, what about a comma? How do you handle that? How do we integrate that all into CSS? That's incredibly important for low vision individuals as well as people with cognitive disabilities, because people need to be able to recognize content quickly in order to be able to read it. More work for the developer and content creator is providing summaries of documents. And so taking that extra time to give a summary at the top. How many of you actually read the legal agreements when you sign up for a new service? Right? How many of you would read one paragraph summary of it in plain language? I would, yeah. I mean, that's huge. That would be such great help. And that helps, again, people with cognitive disabilities, learning disabilities, it helps all of us too. So that kind of effort forward is just really important. Yeah.
Do you speak with governmental bodies about
Yes.
stuff like this?
And I should have included those in my list. So the Access Board is included in all of these conversations, as well as representatives from most of the major countries doing accessibility within their legal space. And so there's kind of two different ways. People are either on the board as a representative, and Bruce Bailey is the rep to WCAG for the Access Board here. But then the other way is that every time a document's created, it goes out for review. And so it goes to, and there's requirements that the document can't move forward unless X number of active countries, governments have said, yes, we're comfortable with this. So there's two different ways they get engaged.
A lot of this seems also applicable to, I mean, not internet-based things. Like I feel
Absolutely.
like I've read an absentee ballot that has a lot of these principles.
So these are plain language principles, and if you're interested in this particular objective, there's a plainlanguage.gov that provides some great resources on it. It does apply across all content. This to me is the editor and the English teacher type objective, and in fact here, this is an example of the two differences. So this is plain language versus not plain language. landlord's right to deduct. It just goes on with all these very technical terms versus, oh, here's 2 bullet points and what you need to understand. And taking that extra time to write plain language just really engages people. And I keep saying with cognitive and learning disabilities, but I'm betting everybody's like, okay, and me, right?
Question about plain language. How do you reconcile the growing popularity of using things like numbers as letters, like you have tally and shortly?
I do.
It tends to be more names of things rather than main content.
And
but
it's,
how do you reconcile it with the objective 3?
so some of it is providing text alternatives. So for like tally and socially, I have alternative text that actually has the word itself
So
when
you
it's
run
tied up
tag
and
that
shown.
word and says this is the alternative for that
Exactly,
text.
so here's the alternative and flipping it. A lot of this, I think when personalization comes, it'll be a question of which do you present, and that'll be an option to look at. So you can switch pictures, you can switch text. Do I want the technical, do I want the not technical? So again, how do we reach both audiences at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
Right now, we're kind of constrained with, you'd have to write a setting that would flip it between the two, but as personalization becomes more, I think that will get better. I think it causes problems for both people with dyslexia and people with dyscalculia. When you start doing those words, right? Like there's not instant word recognition with it anymore.
And screen readers.
And screen readers. Although the screen readers have dictionaries, you can change them, so you have one problem through. But I think it should have been a question, and it's a hard one, because there's already so much challenges around that space of language and word recognition.
I had a question specifically about the representing numbers as, or like having some sort of alternatives, because that's what I'm having a major issue with at the moment.
Yeah.
Do you have like concrete examples of what sort of alternatives people can use?
I don't with me now, but there are some on the web.
Okay.
So if afterwards you want to leave your email with me, I will send you those examples happily. Or if there's any, I don't know, is there an email I can send things to for anyone
Yeah, you can
interested?
send
Or
it to me so that I can
Okay.
send
Or
it
is anyone of interest? So either way, or both.
Okay.
But yes, there is guidance. Generally, it is to provide some text description. So I'm going to give a complex example. One of the things that's being worked on right now is Silver, which is the brand new version of WCAG. So it's WCAG 3.0. We're dot iterating right now, 2.1, 2.2, but there is a recognition that it's not as designed with the constraints as designed, meeting the needs of as many people as we want to meet. And so there's been a multi-year effort to understand how do we change it, how do we shift it, how do we think about it. Tied to that, there's been how do we test conformance, and this goes to the government question. How do we figure out whether it passes or fails so in a legal environment it works? And tied to conformance is this question of bias. And I don't know if you all study algorithm bias, but anytime you set up a system of numerics, you have potential for bias. Well, how do we talk with the people in the cognitive task force about numerical bias when we're providing them algorithms they have to understand, right? And the only alternative, we write text. Okay, how is this algorithm working? How is it engaging numbers? How is it going to work? Because and so you basically write a paragraph to go with, here's all the numbers, and here's a description of what we actually mean. And even for short mathematical concepts, that's usually the way to go, is to provide some kind of textual alternative to it. But I think there are really great concrete examples I didn't bring. So, yeah.
So this all sounds like pretty expensive, which is fine for me because, you know, I'm the one who gets paid to do all but
So fair.
but like, yeah, like how would you like kind of balance like the price? I mean,
There's
this
a couple of
is
different
expensive,
things. So the content generation especially, it's time consuming. You have people who specialize in it, and you have to provide additional content like summaries or the text for that. So I completely agree, there is an expense that goes with that. I would argue a lot of this actually isn't expensive if you're thinking about it up front. I would even go so far to argue that if you are doing really good usability, you're covering a lot of this
Oh yeah.
right up front, like again. So for the extra ones that are expense, I mean, the argument is people with cognitive and learning disabilities is one of the biggest disability categories.
Oh yeah, no.
People who are distracted and tired and overworked is an even bigger category. And so taking that extra time to provide that content, the argument I would make is going to make whatever you are creating more successful, because you're going to reach everybody.
So my second question is, like, should this be more on like the shoulders of the browser developers, people who are building the
Yeah.
actual things we
Mhm.
put on like the web developers, the websites.
And that goes to that tension.
Okay.
Which way does it go? Right now, it's, my opinion only, right now it's falling a little more on the content side because the browsers are not as involved in the WCAG standard development as they were in 1.0.
Because they have the money.
But at this point, I think there's a lot of conversation around how does that get a little more integrated on the browser side. But even when it does, the content authors have to tag, they have to think about it, they have to do clean work, they have to provide some extra information. Now, if you're linting, if you're providing any kind of development environment that makes suggestions, the goal is you get all of this right in that development environment and it just plugs it in as you go. Right? That is kind of the easiest way to do accessibility from scratch. But we're not there. This is really what's coming out and what's coming, not what is already there and what has the tools to support it. That was that. All right, prevent users from making mistakes. This to me reads usability straight all the way, right? Do not provide ways to make errors. So, but I think one of the big things is around undo and timeouts. So something I learned when I really started working in the cognitive space was just how difficult and painful timeouts are, because there is this concept of fatigue. For other disabilities, so say someone who's blind, goes to a page, it has all images on that page, and there's no alt text on it. They are going to fail. Everyone can agree there is going to be a strict failure there. For people who experience seizures, go to a page, it has bright flashing, on and off, high contrast, low contrast. Now we're in a medical area, and again, people are all going to agree that's a failure. 100 problems on errors, bad language, misorganized, disorganized page, inability to go back, add a timeout. No one of those things can you get consensus that it's a failure. And yet it will stop people with cognitive disabilities in aggregate because of the fatigue just as effectively as the alt text and the flashing will. And again, that's another complexity with how do you think about this, how do you do it? Because it's not this one or this one causes a failure. It's all of this together causes a failure. So the ability to undo errors, the ability to come back for these, the big user story for this one, just to touch upon it again, is users who need to take breaks during tasks. I want to be able to be sure that my work is saved automatically. If my computer crashes, I don't want to have to start over again. I don't want to time out. I mean, that's really around the space and what is important here. Letting users know when content changes. So again, thinking about the airline, all of a sudden your airline isn't available anymore, you need to let the user know that. Yeah.
You mentioned some of the people at the table, like the Amazons and the Googles. How much of this might be industry norm habits? So I'm thinking like concert and sport venues, when you buy tickets, they're famous for having buy this within the next 5 minutes or we're going to relinquish your tickets.
Yep.
So is there a conversation space with some of these sorts of activities with certain types of industries?
There's a lot of conversations around this and around the industry. So the recommendation in that case isn't to take the timeout away because you don't have a choice, you can only lock it so long. It's to let people know, you're entering a process, you're going to have 5 minutes. And I've seen this more and more on those concert sites. You will have 5 minutes to make a decision after you click this button. Be prepared. So if you need your coffee break now, go take your coffee break now and then come back. And that trivializes a little bit, but the point being giving people heads up. Or this is a 20-step process. There is a 10-minute timeout. You need to know that you're not going to be able to take more than a 10-minute break. So those kind of heads up have been the way around those conversations. But I would say at any given moment, there are conversations in the industry around how do we do this, how do we think about it, what's the right way to solve it. Again, for me coming into it a couple years ago, I was just blown away by how collaborative people are in this space and how do we fix things.
This might be specific, but has there been work on making form validation more customizable? Because one thing is, I mean, I've noticed form validation, you can specify this thing has to be a number.
Right.
And if you fail that, it will highlight the thing that failed. It will mark it in red or whatever the browser does, and it will have a tooltip that says you have to put it here, and that's very nice.
Yep.
But if you have any more complicated constraints, you have to custom code that, and you can't activate that tooltip in JavaScript that is like very, very baked into the browser.
Mhm.
I don't know, has anyone been talking about that?
So there's been conversation around the ideal form handles no matter what date format you put in. For example, to keep this an example simple, like so, should be able to take the content and adjust it as much as possible. Again, that's kind of a usability principle, but it's really important in this space. There hasn't been so much about exactly what you're talking about as far as customizing the tooltips and tied to it. The last big tooltip conversation was more about the ability to get to them than to customize them. But I think that's that's just not one I've heard yet today. Something I will take back. Let's see. So this is the next objective, just helping users focus and restore context. And I mentioned this at the beginning. There is a standard about being able to pause videos on websites. Like that is for this group, individuals who get distracted by that constant motion and movement on the page. But there's also avoiding too much content on the page. So if everything's mushed together, it's not organized, it becomes harder to read. And so, nice simple objective. Comments or questions on that one?
Question about too much content. One of the popular sites now is to have one giant page
Mhm.
with different sections to it.
Yep.
Is that considered a too much content page, or can it just structure in such a way that it's
If it's structured to break it down, it's not considered too much content. It's really around, here is just blocks of text or blocks of content, and I can't parse it or make decisions about it. Whether you break it across pages or you put it in a single page, as long as it's structured, it's fine.
How much is too much?
Oh, good question, and this is why it's not testable. So, you know it when you see it, that's a horrible answer. It's really about how well is it broken down and how well is it understandable. And one of the big pushes this document has, and I'll touch on it in just a minute, is user testing. So how do you know? You pull your aging grandmother, you ask somebody with a cognitive disability to try it out, you whatever you need to do to get a range of people really engaged in doing usability testing. That's how you know the answer. All right. Processes do not rely on memory. So this is around making sure that people are able to do things without necessarily having a good memory. So as a user who has memory impairments, I need to use a site without being required to transcribe items in the correct sequence. So for example, if I need to go through a process and take this piece of information and put it here, and then the next piece of information there, and remember what the first piece of information is, it's not going to be successful for people who have memory challenges. If you give your users information at the beginning and require they remember it at the end, probably not going to work well. Processes need to be simple, as little multi-step as possible. And then, those are really kind of the big ones. And a lot around design authentication here is where most of the work in this area is right now.
Could you explain what's the first point? Logging in does not rely on group memory or other components.
So there's a couple ways to do this. From a content standpoint, as an author, you can provide a password, or you can provide two-factor authentication, or you can provide a thumbprint or face recognition. None of those biometric authentication require memory. So that's what this is going to. From a provider, kind of coding and provider standpoint, do you provide alternatives? Do you force the user to type their password, or can they copy and paste it? Like if they maintain one password, can they bring it in and put it in your site, or have you constrained it? Like that would probably be the ultimate failure of this, is I won't let somebody get information in here except hand type it. Because even going back and forth between screens can be tough. So that's what it's getting to.
So that would effectively not help people who have less focus.
So this is around memory,
Right.
specifically around memory. And actually this is one of the ones that will be a standard, I think, in 2.2. It's getting a lot of push, and it's around whatever login process you have, it's called accessible authentication, has at least one way that does not require sight, at least one way that does not require memory, at least one way that does not require having a finger or a hand. Like the biometrics are their own problem too. You have to have alternatives. So that's what I think you're going to see in the next 2.2.
So there are a lot of problems with using using things like biometrics. For example, if your fingerprint gets compromised, if someone makes a copy, you're not going to be able to get a new one, right? then that, like, the fundamental point of a password is that you can rotate passwords. Like,
Yep.
this is one thing that makes it different. Would password managers be sufficient in order to allow people to have to like require a password? Because two-factor is supposed to be the second factor. It's not
Right.
supposed to be
So
the first.
factor. So yes, if you build a password field that lets you either copy paste or integrate with a password manager, and so again, you're not forcing them to type, and you have a secondary method, that would pass. I wouldn't say probably, that would pass. And so it's really around how are you thinking about it. If you had biometrics or something, that would be another way.
Do you know of any password managers that are not difficult to use for people with cognitive disabilities?
No. No. There is always compromise in the standards portion, but I guess I challenge you all as designers and developers, think about what could you do? You know, how could you make this easier? And this is something I think we all talk about and think about too is, all right, we know we have password managers, well, how do you make a password manager work well? At least there is only one password somebody has to remember, and it will give them access to everything. That is better than having 50 sites and having to remember 50 passwords. But you really don't want them to need a caretaker to put their passwords in, to get to their bank accounts. You do not want them to have to use a non-secure password. So how do we think about this space? I think there's a lot of area for research in this. I think there's a lot of area for growth in this, in the usability, HCI, security perspective. I think it's actually a huge area going forward. Yeah.
Yes, like what about security? So like a password manager is not necessarily as secure as something else. So if you were,
Yeah.
if you like, say if I'm the president, God forbid, but I need to know my password. I can't just be like, oh, here's these LastPass to, launch the nuclear.
Right, but it's less secure than you having to tell somebody else your password or having it posted on your computer.
That's true.
Which is a lot of solutions to the password problem, right? You just have Post-it notes on your computer. That's why I say there's a lot of research and thought, I think, that still is in this space. I don't think anybody has here's a great answer to this yet. But we definitely know it needs work. Well, I'm at my 10 minutes. All right, providing help and support. I think that one probably speaks for itself, and we talked about it a little bit as far as making it easy for people to set reminders, making it easy for people to identify, find, get to help, whatever that form of help is. That's really what this is around. And this is the last one I was talking about, making sure people can adapt and personalize, and that you aren't stopping them. So when you code, you do not forbid them to use CSS. It's like using non-responsive design. If you use a site that doesn't adapt to mobile, all of a sudden you have a lot of problems. So you want to make sure you're thinking about that. And that is letting people select the version of content they want, display only the main content, replacing symbols, supporting features like widgets and keyboard shortcuts. That's another part of this. So it's the whole ability to personalize and adapt. All right, going back to your warm-up question. So you thought about something that didn't go well. Would these have solved it? Like if these were regular standard practice in industry, would it have solved whatever you ran into in the last month that caused you the most frustration? It would for me. I can tell you what frustrated me the most this month is I spent 3 hours grading an exam. I hit submit. It looked like it took. I hit back. It erased all 3 hours of exam results. So, I know I frustrated my students, but if that back button was supported, if it had said, hey, you're about to lose all your data, that alone would have solved my problem. So again, just thinking about this, it really does affect usability. It's really, really, really important. This is the user testing portion of this, making sure that you do integrate people with cognitive disabilities into your usability testing. Get them involved early. Obviously, don't just ask questions, that's good usability principle. Make sure they're doing things, active usability testing. But there are some differences and things to think about when you integrate with people with cognitive impairment. So ensure that the forms are written to be easy to understand. All those consent forms, they need to be understandable. You need to make sure that you give the participant an option to bring a second person, caretaker, family member, someone else to advocate for them, because they may not be comfortable in usability testing saying this is too much, or this is not enough. You need somebody there to help them if they want it. And in all usability testing, we spend a lot of time saying we're testing the interface, we're not testing you. but even more so for this population. You need to articulate that. And then instead of complex methods of assessing things, give them smiley faces, give them simpler, easy to understand rating scales. And those are just things to make sure you integrate. I think I talked about most of the challenges I wanted to already. These are ways you can get involved. So if you have a few minutes, if this interests you, I highly encourage you, go read the document. You can provide comments directly to the task force using that URL. If you are more comfortable, you can email me and you want them to be anonymous, and I will plug them into the correct places so those comments are integrated and talked about. You also, if this is somewhere you're going in your research, if this is something you're interested in, you can request becoming an invited expert. Something that's really important to at least the WK, I think the W3C, is bringing in new people, new voices, new thoughts. You all have had a lot of them today, and getting that integrated and involved. It is a really interesting, if slightly detail-oriented process, but you learn a lot and you contribute a lot. So it's just a neat way to kind of get involved. So that is something you can also look at. And I think I have 5 minutes, but I might be right. There's some links here, and I'm going to send you the slides to send out. There are personas that are tied to this. There are research-oriented issue papers that everything I talked about was based on. And there's a really nice handbook for joint research with people with cognitive disabilities that came out of Europe's easy reading process. I also just wanted to provide you, so as you think about research processes and things going forward, it walks you through the consent form. It walks you through how to integrate and involve and work with people and what you need to do. So.
And where's the RFC that you said we should look at and read and give comments on?
Just miss it. No, sorry. First one. It was the very first slide, wasn't it? If you Google or search COGA, I know it works in COGA content and usable, you will get it. It's the top. Okay. But it's also w3.org/tr/COGA-usable. And we would love your comments and feedback. Thank you all. I really appreciate you being so phenomenally conversational. Anything else before we wrap up? All right. Thank you. Have a great day.